Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our first forest restoration webinar in 2024. Today, we will discuss a recap of the COP28 and the implications for forests, for ecosystem restoration and nature conservation. And just to tell you a little bit again about the webinar, it is a webinar series that is organized on a monthly basis by the Superb Project and IUFRO's Task Force on transforming forest landscape for future climates and human well-being. And we investigate forest restoration questions from diverse scientific perspectives, also from practitioners' perspectives, and we have an alternating focus on both the global and then the European level. And the idea of the series is really to bring together researchers, practitioners, NGOs, and policymakers and other interested stakeholders to explore also what is kind of practically needed to restore forest or to stop also deforestation, what the experiences are, and also the challenges that we're facing worldwide. And today I'm really happy that we have two speakers who will share a little bit of their impressions and thoughts with you. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, Trevor Walter from WWF. He's a forest scientist with a master's degree in forest ecology from the University of Washington, and he's currently the leader of WWF's transformational initiative on landscape restoration in LAC. And over the last 10 years, he has been working in the field of restoration. He was also promoting action and reaching out to a wide diversity of stakeholders, both at global and regional levels. And he's now based in Chile. And his work has been related to guidance on implementing forest landscape restoration principles for high quality landscape restoration, and also policy advocacy for strong national restoration commitments, which of course also need to be supported by effective plans. However, before I talk more about Trevor's work, I would like to give you the floor. Before I give you the floor, just some little minor rules about the webinar, which I forgot. Next slide, please, Priscilla. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available to watch on the EFI YouTube account and on the IUFRO website. And if you have questions to the panelists, please use the dedicated Q&A box. After this presentation, we will also then promote selected participants to speakers so that you can ask the questions yourselves. In case you don't want that, you just we will just read out the questions from the chat. And if you want to tweet about the webinar, then it would be lovely if you would tag us with IUFRO and Superb Project. I did this so often that I forgot the housekeeping rules because I was so excited to listen to Trevor. Anyways, now I will hand over to Trevor. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the COP and what you think needs to be done, etc.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you, and good morning if there's anyone else further west of me. I'm, as she said, based in Chile, and I'm the Transformational Initiative on Landscape Restoration lead for WWF in Latin America. Our transformation initiative is an internal push by our organization to upscale forest and landscape restoration at a regional level across at least the 12 countries where we are based, with WWF offices working with partners and governments alike. And much of the initial information I want to share with you, I think you may be aware of already, quite familiar, but we're in a context of these global crises, of a climate crisis, where, as you can see, we are in a place we have never been before, and in the same sense in the crisis of biodiversity, where, as we've been reporting from WWF in our Living Planet report, we've had a major decrease in biodiversity coming to the point where here in Latin America, we've seen a 94% decrease in the viability of vertebrate species, which is the most marked decrease across all of the continents globally. So we're very much aware of these two crises and also their integrated nature. They are not separable and we cannot act upon them separately. Rather, they need to be addressed with the measures that are cross-cutting to both and can provide impact and change in both senses. And so here, just to go back and look at some of the context of at least our region, which I'm sure is very similar to that of others, we're looking at a huge loss of forested area and a huge loss of areas that have been degraded. And this is an ongoing process. Sometimes we see a positive, well, not positive, rather a slowing of these tendencies, but overall we are still losing out. And as I mentioned, this has much to do with the context of the biodiversity in our region. Yet when we're talking about landscape restoration, we also see that there's great potential to work on landscape restoration. And investment of a single dollar can produce up to $30 of returns in different formats, sometimes not always economically valued, but effectively they are benefits that spur from restoration. And equally here, I'm talking about the mitigation potential that restoration has. But I think it's also a very important point to note that restoration has great potential to address not only mitigation, but adaptation to climate change. And perhaps even more so because we know that the climate is changing and that there's no avoiding that. And we are seeing more and more impacts of climate change occurring right now. Some of you may have been listening to the news recently, but we had some terrible fires here in Chile over the last weeks that have really, really affected people in the urban-rural interface. And in Chile, fires are 99% caused by humans, but very much exacerbated by climate change. They are becoming much more frequent and much more intense. And so what we would like to see happen here is a large upscaling of forest and landscape restoration. And I put these principles up on the screen because it's very important to us when we're talking about forest and landscape restoration. We don't want to just use a buzzword. We want to ensure that we are promoting and implementing the highest quality forest and landscape restoration possible. And I use the term forest and landscape restoration because for us it's important to ensure that other ecosystems, non-forest ecosystems, are included in our landscape restoration, including coastal and marine ecosystems. Is very much aligned with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and shares a lot of the same principles. But underlying the definition of this is, as many of you may know, that we're seeking to regain ecological functionality and at the same time enhance human well-being through our interventions in degraded landscapes. And it includes a wide variety of things that are specific to each of the landscape where they're applied. In Latin America, as well as in Africa and other regions of the globe, there have been major commitments under the Bond Challenge to restoring degraded and deforested areas. In Latin America, through the 2020 initiative, the multi-stakeholder government-led platform, countries have made public commitments to 52 million hectares of restoration across 17 countries. But these 2030 targets are not being implemented as quickly as needed, and we're really lacking the momentum to get where we need to go. And in fact, it's very hard to even measure how far we've come, but I would say that we are much below even the 20 million hectares that were projected to be restored or in the process of restoration by 2020, the original name of this platform. But I don't mean to be muckraking the initiative, rather trying to work with different actors to find ways to move forward the restoration agenda in a context where we, among others, and the UN Decade have identified a suite of barriers that need to be addressed to move forward on restoration. And really, there are lots of pieces here that are very fundamental when we're looking at the context of the UN conventions and trying to find ways to promote action. As I mentioned before, our interest is that restoration focus on landscapes. And I wanted to show you this here because these are the countries where we as WWF are active. And each of these countries has defined at least one priority landscape, which is going to be our context of a model and an example for others to see what it means to apply the approach of landscape restoration and to strive for the highest quality. One of these landscapes in particular, the Upper Paraná and the Atlantic Forest ecoregion, is now a UN Decade flagship landscape, not just as WWF, but among all of the actors, both in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, that are working to restore this very important and biodiverse ecoregion. And when we're looking to landscape restoration, it's very important for us to look for objectives that are very important to the landscape, understanding that restoration can provide multiple benefits, and ensuring that others see these benefits coming out of the restoration efforts, because often they are overlooked, especially in the context of policy and government funding and prioritizing. So these benefits for nature and people are key to understanding and to promoting the importance of restoration in these policy spaces, particularly. We're looking at a space where our strategy as WWF is looking to, at the global level, promote the goal of 350 million hectares under restoration. But particularly in our region, we would like to see at least 30 million hectares in restoration by 2030. And to do so, we're trying to develop ways that we can unlock and get over some of these barriers that I showed you earlier through strengthening governance, both understood as policy level national and subnational governance, as well as landscape governance that really includes all of the stakeholders that are in the landscapes. We also know that financing is such a major issue, and financing needs to come both from public as well as private sources. And in doing so, we need to involve not only economic ministries of countries, but also the finance and the private sector to work with markets and find innovative approaches to channel funding to restoration. And as I mentioned before, a part of our work focuses on ensuring that what is conducted, what is going onto the ground is high quality, that ensures that all of the principles of landscape restoration are met, all of the stakeholders are participating, that there is a real focus on the landscape rather than just on the interventions, ensuring that benefits come to the whole landscape from the actions that are carried out. So here I wanted to move to the context, and I understand that there'll be more of a deep dive into reflections on COP28, but this is a particularly important place for restoration right now, because we're seeing that one of the outcomes is specifically stated an intention to seek to halt and reverse forest loss. So this language about reversing forest loss is this place where forest and landscape restoration is so important. And this becomes something that creates a space that prioritizes and enables restoration commitments to be included within countries' NDCs. So this is a key moment where in the past, restoration has been rather absent in a large part of countries' national commitments. However, it has been included in some. In some, it has been included with ambitious and quantitative targets that specifically look at a time frame for these actions. But we need to see that happening quite a lot more. And from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, we also see a very important opportunity because the Target 2 seeks to have 30% of degraded areas across different ecosystem types restored by 2030. So we have two international policy contexts that are very strong for landscape restoration that we need to take advantage of, and we need to also ensure that they are cross-cutting. The ideal policies in the commitments for NDCs and NBSAPs in biodiversity and climate need to represent the same structure for the countries. A country policy looking at specifically the need for restoration and how that can be applied to benefit both biodiversity and climate. We're seeing that, as I mentioned, few countries have these ambitious quantitative targets for restoration. And now is a key moment because NDC targets or NDC documents need to be updated by 2025 at COP30 in Brazil. Similarly, but even more urgently, Target 2 goes into the National Biodiversity Action Plans, which need to be updated by this year in October in Colombia. So right now is a key moment for us to be talking with our governments, to be providing them the information that they need to effectively incorporate these pieces of restoration information within their policy frameworks, not only in their commitments, but also structurally in the way that they are approaching biodiversity, climate, adaptation, mitigation, and also social development. So we as WWF are trying to develop these instruments, which we hope to be able to share widely. But three of the main recommendations that we have are that governments ensure that they have quantifiable restoration targets that are cross-cutting, that have the highest ambition, that seek the highest quality, that cover multiple ecosystems, not just forests, and that really can be measured or can respond to clear objectives on the ground. It isn't just biodiversity, isn't just climate, but it's specific things that may have to do with contexts that are very specific to a country, whether it's fire, whether it's flooding, whether it may be related to biodiversity connectivity. Bringing all these things together under one really strong restoration strategy. We also see that these need to be adequately funded. Funding needs to increase both from public and private sources. The public sector has a key role in creating the enabling conditions for private finance for restoration, but also creating the safeguard framework to ensure that high quality restoration is occurring and that there are not negative impacts or issues with rights holders in countries, and that benefits and access to finance are equally distributed and equally available. And finally, The other highlight of a recommendation we have is on monitoring, ensuring that the systems for monitoring are robust, can communicate impact, are transparent, and are really able to reach all of the different objectives that countries have for restoration. And so bringing these three pieces together, we're able to look at a lot more of the fine detail, but in the great overview, really trying to push forward these three pieces with information behind them that allows a country to effectively elaborate the text of a real commitment around these areas is key. And as I said, we're in the perfect moment of opportunity to be able to influence countries to include these, and then posteriorly to develop them in greater detail that will ensure effective implementation of restoration over the next years, and hopefully as well beyond 2030, and really address the gaps that we're seeing both for biodiversity and climate. And here we have a great document that WWF produced at the end of last year, where even beyond restoration, we are seeking for ways to integrate NDCs and NBSAPs, because there are so many ways that these are linked. And really, restoration itself within this context, as I mentioned, is related to both mitigation and adaptation, but it also touches on multiple targets of the global biodiversity framework. We cannot consider restoration in isolation from targets such as Target 1 on spatial planning or Target 3 related to protected areas. Nearly all of the targets within the GBF have a relationship with restoration, and it's important that we ensure that not only is there climate and biodiversity integration, but within these two spaces there's integration across the different issues that are present there. And I think that is generally it for me. I was told 20 minutes and hopefully have stayed within that framework. And I'll be happy to continue on answering questions, as it were, as we move.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for this presentation. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but we can ask those afterwards. I also want to encourage the audience to add their questions in the Q&A. But before we come to the questions session, I would love to introduce our second speaker, who has a little bit of a comment today. Her name is Alice Bisiaux, and she has been leading the EU REDS facility's legal work on land allocation and forest conversion. And she's now working for the European Forest Institute International Partnership Facility. So we're colleagues. And before joining the facility, Alice worked as an environmental lawyer in London. And she then also followed the international climate change negotiation for over 10 years. So she has lots of experience with these topics and consulted for various international NGOs and the UN. And she's also teaching climate change negotiation at the, I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly, ESADE University in Barcelona. Thank you very much, Alice, for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to your little overview perspective on what the COP meant for forests in general, so that we can also put this into perspective.
Thanks a lot, Casey. Welcome. Well, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon or good day or good evening from wherever you join us. I'll start sharing my slides. Okay, you see them properly? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So a caveat before I jump in. I wasn't at the COP last year, so it's a very general overview of bits and pieces of information that I have gathered during the COP. Yeah, but really nothing firsthand. So with that, I'll jump in. So before I focused on forests only, I thought, because I'm a bit, as Gage has said, I'm a bit of a COP nerd, and this COP particularly was very much like a soap opera. There was a lot of drama, even, I mean, in the lead up to the COP and during the COP. Especially because it was held in the UAE, so for a climate COP to be held in a petrostate, that sort of generated a lot of noise, of course. One of the main outcomes of the COP was this decision calling for a transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable way. And although it was not what most people had hoped for, because we were hoping for a strong call for phasing out fossil fuels, it was still quite an achievement. And the EU negotiator summed up the mood in a way, because so the EU had pushed back very strongly on an earlier draft of this decision that was a lot more watered down, or even more watered down. And he said, this is a day of solemn satisfaction. Solemn because what's been secured is not enough, and a lot of people will suffer as a result of it. But satisfaction because it's a decision that for the first time the COP is putting a name on the problem and addressing fossil fuels in the decision. And that decision was adopted in a petrostate at a COP very highly influenced by fossil fuel companies. And so Al Jaber, who was the COP president, here sitting in the middle with the gavel, he's the CEO of ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So within this context, it was quite an achievement still. Sorry for all this side show. Well, not the side show, but the not really bang on forests. But this is just to say that most of the stuff that I will address now is not part of the formal negotiations. And at the COP, a lot of the discussions on forest actually took place in what's called the sort of sideshow, the side events, etc. So I will not talk about things that you might have read in the press about the loss and damage fund, or well, Trevor mentioned the global stocktake and the need to revise NDCs, or the global goal on adaptation, or the carbon market, the negotiations on articles, what's called Article 6 under the Paris Agreement on carbon markets. So yeah, I'll just provide an overview of a few things that were achieved during the COP as it relates to mainly forest conservation and fighting deforestation. So one of these agreements was the Leaders' Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action. And that was quite a milestone because it's the first time ever there was a declaration at a high level putting together food system and climate. It was endorsed by over 150 countries. And it calls for improved coherence between food system transformation and climate action. And it was quite historic because so far, I mean, agriculture has been on the agenda of the COP for decades, but usually not even a decision is adopted, or if a decision is adopted, it's very procedural and nothing of substance is agreed upon, because, and that's, if I want to oversimplify, it's because developing countries were very reluctant to be imposed any mitigation measures in the way they produce food, because of course food production is so intrinsically related to poverty eradication, eradicating hunger, and they didn't want to be imposed any kind of restriction on their food production. So that was quite an achievement. And of course, food production, agriculture is one of the main drivers of deforestation. So that's it's quite welcome. The declaration also, well, in the declaration, the leaders commit to include food and land use in their revised NDCs. So we'll see in 2025 if they really do so. Now, COP28 also reflected in a number of ways on the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use. So that declaration, I'm sure you've heard, was adopted 2 years before at COP26, and it includes the target to halt and reverse forest loss by 2030. While delivering on sustainable development. So at COP28, the leaders adopted this joint statement on climate, nature, and people, in which the signatories commit to scale up finance, involve indigenous people, and improve data collection. So they reiterated their commitment. Now, in other related announcements, also a bit under the umbrella of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, well, there was this Forests and Climate Leaders Partnership, which was created at COP27, so 1 year after Glasgow. And this partnership announced a number of country packages for countries with high forest cover to support their national forest conservation plans. And then also during the World Climate Action Summit, 2.5 billion was mobilized to protect and restore nature. And then Brazil had a significant presence. Of course, Lula's agenda of fighting deforestation is quite high, especially coming after the Bolsonaro administration, and he proposed a global tropical forest forever fund that would focus on, of course, on as the name indicates, on the protection of tropical forests. And also the LEAF Coalition announced agreements with Costa Rica and Ghana for REDD+ credits. So all these, sort of on the sidelines of the formal negotiations. And then relevant to the EU, the Team Europe initiative on deforestation-free value chain was launched. And this was launched by the EU and its member states. It's this initiative, so as the name indicates, it focuses on supporting producing countries to get rid of deforestation within their supply chains. And it includes a project called SAFE, which stands for Sustainable Agriculture for Forest Ecosystems. And it's active in a number of tropical countries. This initiative, so that it's the Team Europe initiative, or TEI, is also aligned with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, and it will, as I mentioned, help support countries in these efforts. And then the last thing I'd like to draw your attention to is blue carbon. So this, it's something that also drew attention during the COP, because again, quite specific to the context of that COP and it being in the UAE. So blue carbon is a very recent UAE-based company, and during the COP it announced some deals with a number of African countries, including Liberia, Kenya, Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania. So basically blue carbon was going to provide money, but would control over 30 million hectares of forests across these countries, so huge tracts of land, of forest land. And that has raised the concern of in relation to indigenous people's rights and local communities, because Blue Carbon plans to establish forest conservation schemes and then sell the possible carbon offsets on the international carbon market that would be set up under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And the thing is, it seems very so the scale is huge. The fact that it's a new UAE company raises some red flags, and also the fact that these African countries, most of them do not have the legal framework in place to protect the rights of indigenous people and local communities, or frame who owns the rights, the carbon rights of these forests. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was exactly the inside information and interpretation that I was hoping for. So thanks a lot for that. We have the floor open for questions now. I will moderate this panel together with Andreas Beuter from IUFRO, my co-moderator. We have a question in the chat already. Not sure if Paul wants to ask the question live. We will check it out. Otherwise, I will just read it. And maybe while my colleague is promoting him to become a panelist, I have a first question to Trevor, because you mentioned those three pillars. They're kind of the three things that you would like to see, which is ambitious, quantifiable restoration targets, adequately scaled funding mechanism, and robust systems to communicate impact. And as a communications expert, I'm of course interested in the last one. Of course, the other are very important and relevant as well, but I wonder how this could look like. How could those robust systems to communicate the impact look like, and what would be different if we would have those, and why don't we have those already?
It's a very good question. And here we really wanted to touch on two pieces that are key. One is that we need to be able to measure what it is that we're doing and the impacts that restoration is producing. And that is a very difficult thing to do sometimes, because those objectives, the objectives for restoration, are often so different in so many countries. And here what we need is something that goes beyond measuring how many hectares are in the process of restoration, but rather what is the impact of restoring those hectares. And so that means that a lot of the indicators need to be nationally specific. There are a lot of efforts to come up with a kind of a common framework for developing monitoring plans, such as the Aurora, which is something done with FAO and WRI. And it has indicator types that are very, very good, but often very technical. We need technical indicators that allow us to follow the impact of the things that we're doing related to the objectives that countries have. And some of those can be aggregated at a regional, global level, as it were. But the communication piece is also very interesting and important, because with the information that we generate from a robust monitoring system, we need to be able to communicate the impacts, because in many cases, there are actors that are not aware of the importance and the opportunity that restoration presents if we have a long-term vision for what comes out of it. Often countries are more focused on the immediacy of a disaster or a political context, but don't have this cross-cutting or or long-term vision that allows them to say, this is what we want to invest in for the next years. So having a strong communication system, even before we're able to report impact, is very important, because the science is there. The science is behind restoration, saying what type of impact we can achieve. And it's not reaching the right people at policymaker levels, the decision makers that are behind commitments, but also dealing with more of the day-to-day issues. And so being able to construct a system that communicates well the significance of restoration is key to securing both the structures that we need now, and to be able to prove that effectively the investment and the work done on restoration is creating the benefits that we're seeking, both socially and in terms of these large-scale spaces on biodiversity and climate, which are not only local but are global spaces, especially taking into context that many of the species that we're looking at have such large ranges or are migratory. So we both need to have these different levels. But particularly, I think there's a lack of understanding about the social impact that restoration can have and the benefits that it can generate in terms of the spending that a country has, particularly looking at how we can create mechanisms related to disaster risk reduction, which can in the long term save countries enormous amounts of money, because the impact of a fire, a flood, or any other type of activity, I mean, especially, we could consider the space with loss and damage. I mean, hopefully that restoration can be applied so that we can mitigate a lot of impact there, and countries will have resources to spend on other priorities, or effectively continue this type of work, which will definitely be necessary in the long term.
Thank you very much. That answers my question. And also thank you for putting the emphasis on the value of the communication about what we're doing to also not just increase awareness, but also to trigger to action. Andreas, of course, we're moderating together. You can just step in. Yes.
Yeah, the problem that I cannot put the question in the Q&A. So, yeah, but exactly to this point, what do you think, Trevor? Or are you in line also with me? Because after, I think, 2 decades of working on forest landscape restoration and so on different areas and continents, I guess that we have a critical lack of a global restoration success monitoring system, and which touches not only the biophysical aspects like carbon storage, and because if you look on the pledges, they're just hectares. And at the end, you have no idea if there is a net gain of carbon sequestration or not. But also, as you already mentioned, with the social aspect, because at the end, I guess, and you've shown it, but also I think Alice has also shown it, that there's a big link between poverty, between food production and forest restoration. So you cannot solve, forest restoration on its own, but just more or less in combination with the other things. And so social indicators and so on, I think it's very important. So do you have more or less from your side as an NGO, also in a continental or global context, any ideas or more or less proposals for this, or suggestions?
Yes, I think that one piece is the development of these indicators, and trying to get countries to report and be transparent about these things is very important. There have been commitments made in the Bonn Challenge that, really don't meet a standard or the principles of landscape restoration, including things where there's restoration of degraded land that is actually, giving farmers chemical fertilizers to be able to use their land, which may be relevant in reducing the degradation of other land or the expansion of the agriculture frontier. but it's not necessarily the type of impact that we would like to see from real restoration. And since we don't have a lot of these quantitative metrics on what restoration does, a lot of times what we need to look at are telling stories more about the qualitative results of restoration. And we as WWF have put together a series of lessons learned publications on landscape restoration across the globe where we have been involved across the continents. And these publications have some quantitative information about what was done, but really get into the detail of how it was done and include one of the really important pieces, which is sharing failures, things that didn't work out as well as we hoped they would, and providing that information so that others can learn and hopefully will be able to make better decisions. And so these are tools that I really would suggest, if people have interest in WWF's lessons learned on FLR. There are several landscape-specific publications as well as an overview of 20 years of FLR interventions that WWF has produced. So that's one thing. I'm not saying it's the only resource, but I think that's one of the ways we've tried to tackle this lack of information.
Thanks, Trevor, and also for highlighting that you have this recommendations or the lessons learned available. I will follow up because in Superb we're together with other cluster projects who work on other ecosystems. We're working on the so-called nature restoration gateway, where we will collect all those documents, lessons learned, etc. So that's certainly useful. I had a question to Alice, but I think she had to run to the door. So let's look into the chat. And there's a question from Paul Turner-Smith. No, Alice is back. So I will ask, because she might have to leave a little earlier. So I will ask the question to Alice before, and then we can pick up the questions from the chat. Alice, my question to you is, you mentioned the local communities, and we've discussed this already in several of our webinars, that often the engagement with the local communities, and particularly with the indigenous communities when it comes to forest landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration in general is an issue and is often lacking. But they are the ones who, like, someone comes from outside and says, we do this here, and then they are not involved, and but they're the ones who should maintain this in the long run, or they're the ones who took care of the land anyway since centuries. So do you see, based on your experience with the COP, do you see a development there? Because you always, like, when you see those images from the COP, the photos, you see representatives of indigenous communities, but are they, like, really considered? And do you see a change in the last 10 years towards more involvement of those voices from the ground?
Well, well, there's one thing, which is what happens at the COP and then in the real world. But at the COP, indigenous people, as you say, yeah, the COP is a very unique event in that you can have someone from Deutsche Bank and a representative of an indigenous community from Paraguay, say. So at COP26 in Glasgow, together with a number of declarations were adopted, but on top of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on that aims to halt forest loss, there was also a pledge to support indigenous and local communities in securing their land, because it was recognized that this is the first, the indispensable first step, because a wide majority of the land and forest land is held under customary tenure by these communities, and this means that they have no legal proof or that their their land rights are not registered, so they're not properly protected. So in Glasgow, there was this declaration that was adopted, and it pledged to support Indigenous communities in securing their land. I don't remember the figure that was pledged now, because I have a very bad memory for very high figures. But then I know that last year in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, there was an exercise to take stock of what had happened since then on these pledges, and very little had been done, like very little money had been dispersed. And of the money that had been dispersed, very little actually reached these local communities. So not much progress, it seems. Then also again, that comes from my bias from the work I do at the European Forest Institute. One sort of place to watch in relation to the involvement and the engagement of forest and Indigenous people and local communities in decision related to forest land and their lands is the European Union Deforestation Regulation, because once it will be in application, it provides that companies will need to exercise due diligence and ensure that within their supply chain there has not been any violation of Indigenous people rights, including their right for free, prior, informed consent. So the regulation opens the door for third parties to raise these concerns with operators and the EU competent authorities. So arguably there could be things changing in the next few years. I don't know, people being brought to answer for these non-compliances.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention and thank you for raising awareness that there's at least something happening in the EU, and that can also maybe be an example. And I know it was also quite controversially discussed by several companies, but it is certainly a good development for the local communities and their rights. Andreas, do you have a kind of another question, or should I read from the chat?
Yeah, please go and read from the chat, I guess. We should open now also to the audience. Yes, wonderful. We have a question, as already indicated, from Paul Turner-Smith, and he refers to you, Trevor, mentioning a potential of is this $30 return and benefits for every dollar invested? And does such CBA depend on preconditions, for instance, ecosystem condition, governance frameworks, etc., or particular types of investment? And what prospects does the panel hold for maximizing restoration benefits and returns on other continents?
Yeah, so the numbers come from a study that was conducted by the World Resource Institute, and it says up to $30 per dollar invested. And so that means effectively there's a range of return from restoration, and restoration will depend on preconditions of both what type of land, what type of intervention, the conditions of the land, what actions are being carried out. Are there local communities or urban populations that will benefit from restoration? And specifically there, it's also quantifying the services provided, which in many cases, those services are not monetarily valued by the beneficiaries. So this is an important issue because those services are in the space of the commons and not particularly incorporated into most countries' budgets or economic allocations of recognizing this. There are a few places where there's effectively a payment for ecosystem services. So part of what is selected there is related to that and is part of the argument for why these aspects need to be included and need to be valued by national economies and by the users, whether those are society or private users of those services. So sometimes it's easier to access those possibilities when there's a large private user of those services. I know that InBev in many places is involved with different possibilities of ecosystem service payment where they produce, specifically related to water. But in the end, the important thing is that restoration is not a lost investment. Restoration is effectively an investment that produces more than just the money that is put into it. And finding and being able to calculate this is very important. And I would say that most likely in most cases, you would be able to see that benefit occurring, and may even be something that is real currently, but definitely that is not going to be the case in all areas still. This study, I think, is very applicable across the world, and as an argument for why the conception of these, especially services, are so important. But the figure also includes the provision of employment and goods. So especially in systems where you're seeing restoration related to agroforestry, silvopastoral systems, these are systems that clearly are producing an economic return of dollars to the restorer or to the investor. You have a stronger system of production that also contributes to the objectives of restoration and produces effectively goods that go to market and should be able to sell with an added value, or they are more productive lands to be able to produce more within sustainable parameters. So ideally, yes, we would find a way to maximize and try to get the restoration to be able to produce more in a sense, and to have that be an economic or financial stream to support the restoration that we need to see on the ground in more places where effectively these returns can happen.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor, and particularly also for mentioning agroforestry, because that usually also is supporting the local communities. So I wonder why we don't use it more often in Europe, actually. But that's maybe a topic for another webinar. Andreas, do you have an additional question or comment?
Yeah. Thanks for this. But exactly when thinking about this, I think that it's return rate of investments. It's always then the question, the role of the private sector. So at the end, who is earning the $30? And I think, I guess, in the perception of many research and also NGOs, it should come more or less to the local population. But on the other hand, I guess that also private companies who try to invest in forest restoration, that they see also the revenue from the company perception, and this is, I guess, then also a very interesting point, because I guess also global companies are getting more and more interested, more or less, to invest in forest landscape restoration. But at the end, we should be very clear about more or less the the targets, and if there might be also some target conflicts between more or less the ideas of the different companies investing in forest landscape restoration and the local population and the public and the government. So I think we need a very clear and open discussion, and also very clear statements on it, what is meant with this, because I struggle a bit with the very general, if you invest $1, you get $30 back, which could motivate companies just, and at the end you get into more or less, I think, monospecific plantations, very much focus on resource management, so the timber resources and so on. So I guess we should discuss about very clearly, and not to and to be very clear with a different perception, and to solve the conflicts which are in.
Yes. If I may respond, indeed, I think that's a very important point. And in our recommendations, one of the important pieces related to increasing finance is to ensure that there are safeguards in place and a distribution of benefits that are equitable. And also part of that framework is ensuring that as we're looking at this from WWF's point of view as cross-cutting between climate and biodiversity, that we're effectively not producing a negative impact by following or seeking the outcomes from one. As you mentioned, the use of tree plantations in many cases may have important impacts on biodiversity, or may have even negative impacts on other ecosystem services, while there is an important amount of carbon capture. And so when we look at that from a forest and landscape restoration point of view, we are not getting the two pieces that we see are key, that we're effectively increasing the ecosystem functionality and human well-being. And human well-being understood as based on the ecosystem services that ecological functionality supplies, not just on the value of goods generated from an economic system. And so I think is a very important point, and it's something that needs to be considered well when applying these and incorporating the private sector. And I think that both the international space and the role that national governments have in creating enabling conditions, but also requiring certain frameworks that include safeguards for the participation of the private sector within landscape restoration is key.
Thanks, Trevor. Before we have a final question to you from the chat, I would have another question for Alice, which is related to the role of forests in general at the COP. And you mentioned it a little bit, but also based on your experience, do forests as a also crucial ecosystem that can help to combat climate change, do they have the proper visibility and lobby at the COP? And if not, what could be done to give them more space and more importance?
Yeah, well, that depends very much on well, of course, there are two things. So historically, well, two things in terms of again, the distinction between the negotiating, the formal track, and the side events. So in the negotiation track, the issue of forest, the negotiations of the legal framework for dealing with forest and its the interaction with climate, that is already basically it's done. It was with the Warsaw Framework on RED, so quite a few years ago, and now we're still waiting for another piece of the framework, which is the Article 6. So for the carbon market under the Paris Agreement, this is not totally these negotiations didn't successfully conclude in Abu Dhabi. So we'll see what happens next year. So this, of course, the carbon market, because there's so many offsets that could happen in the forest sector that will have a huge impact on forests. But aside from the Article 6, basically the framework is there and forests are not prominent in the negotiations. In the side events and outside the formal negotiations, that depends really on the COP presidency. The COP presidency will decide. Well, the COP presidency has his or her own agenda, and just like when the UK was hosting the COP in Glasgow, they made land use and forest really top priority. So they really, because of course the presidency is not just something that you pick up for 2 weeks and then you forget about it the rest of the year. So the whole year the UK was building up towards it. And just like Trevor was mentioning, COP30 will take place in Brazil, so very likely, and it's supposed to take place in the Amazon. I have no idea how they will host so many people in that region, but so of course it's going to be, forests are likely to be the star of the COP again. But yeah, it depends on what the COP presidency wants to make of it, really.
Thank you. And thank you. It's really cool, all this insider knowledge that you can provide. I can ask you all the questions that I ever wanted to ask about the COP. So that's lovely. And yeah, hopefully then in 25, we'll have more focus on the forest, because in 24, it's in Azerbaijan. So it's probably going to be a little similar to last year. There's a question in the chat still to Trevor, and it relates also a little bit to what Andreas said, the monitoring aspect. It's coming from Trishna Dutta, and she doesn't have video or audio today, but she's really interested in the kind of effective monitoring on the ground, because yeah, all the ambitious restoration goals are of course nice, but she wants to know if there are some overarching best practices which could kind of include specific methods or metrics. You said already that you have some best practices, but maybe a little bit elaborate a little bit more related to for instance the restoration of hills and mines that were largely restored with invasive species like eucalyptus or prosopis, which have little or no biodiversity value. But these then, of course, count as green cover towards the international goals, but are in reality, as she calls it, bogus. Do you have a kind of recommendation, or how is WWF approaching this from the monitoring point of view?
I think that, this is one of the things that is really great when we look at the context of combining biodiversity and climate commitments, because the framework for that means that we are ensuring that activities are going to be contributing to both without creating a negative or undesired impacts that they could come out of using exotic species, or both, as a remediation framework for mines, which, in some cases it's very complicated to do without some cases using those species, but with the objective of getting somewhere in biodiversity, there would need to be a next step that phases those species out and includes native species, but it's also something in the long term. So we look very favorably at in ensuring that countries are considering both elements at the same time, ideally in a cross-cutting commitment, but if not, ensuring that there is good communication between what are often different departments within an environment ministry, or there may be a split between the environment and agriculture ministries related to this, or even there may be ways to engage with the finance ministry to create this connection across the board. But in looking at monitoring specifically, we want to come up with something that is robust and will be able to report back on the objectives that we have. And ideally, as I was saying, those are objectives that are both climate and nature. And in doing so, be able to provide information that's coming out of efforts on both of these material, and ensuring that there aren't these unintended consequences. But it is a challenge, and I won't say that in reality it's not a problem, because effectively the way, for example, the Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed, they have let countries define what their definition of degraded areas are. So they may include or not include things that we as an environmental organization, for example, see as effectively degraded. And so this is a problem, and the importance of us weighing in and making these connections and setting baselines and ensuring that there are social and environmental safeguards for interventions, and a baseline of information from the very beginning on the indicators is key. And so that's what I would say. It's there are lots of suggestions and different platforms for specific types of indicators, and I won't say that they've always been used. And as I mentioned, there have been cases where countries have counted things towards their climate commitments, or even towards their restoration commitments in general, that have not been the highest standard, the most ambitious, which effectively in both biodiversity and climate, the conventions seek that countries make the most ambitious targets possible, and sometimes that's not happening. Which is why we see it's so important to weigh in on these processes that are going to be happening in the next 10 years, or the next 2 years, and are already happening right now.
Thanks a lot, Trevor, also for highlighting also the challenges, because forest landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration in general is not just the restoration; it also has to include the biodiversity conservation aspect. It has to have some kind of revenue, at least a little bit, for those who invest in there, and of course also needs to take the climate and changing climate into account. So it's really complex. That's also a reason why we have this webinar series, to explore all these challenges. I would like to ask my colleague to put, because we will wrap it up now, to put on the slide for the next webinar, which is taking place on the 13th of March, again, Wednesday, from 4 to, let's say, 5:30 p.m. CT. And we will do this together with IU4 again, of course, but then also the 4 Green Deal funded ecosystem restoration projects. So we will look at ecosystem restoration on the landscape level, how it can work in practice and what the challenges are. And we will look into forests, of course, again, but we will also look into freshwater, into peatlands, and into sea level restoration. So this is something that we will have like a more broader view. Yeah, we look forward to discussing with you. Thanks a lot to my co-moderator today, Andreas, and thanks a lot to our fantastic speakers for sharing your insights. And we will provide this also online as a video resource, so you can share it afterwards also with your colleagues. And thanks for the questions from the audience. Have a nice rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you,
Bye-bye.
Gesche, thank you, Gesche, for the perfect moderation.
Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.